So what we talked about thus far is we've talked about what I call sources of uncertainty in public opinion polls, the confidence levels and the confidence intervals. And here's why I call them sources of uncertainty. Because once again, as I told you before, public opinion polls don't measure public opinion. What they do is they estimate public opinion based on a sample. And we know that there's always a possibility that the sample is bad. Right? Just like when I was talking about the spaghetti sauce, and I went ahead and I said, you know, you could mix up your spaghetti sauce and take a little spoonful to try and decide whether the big pot of spaghetti is good or bad. And if it could be that your sample, your spoonful that you taste is not representative. Maybe there's a whole bunch of pepper that got stuck on it. Maybe there's like a big chunk of garlic that got stuck on it. It's like, yikes, right? There's always a chance that the sample is bad. And so there's always uncertainty whenever we do public opinion polls. One, because we're never sure whether or not our sample is representative. And second, there's always a margin of error in our public opinion polls. We're never trying to predict the exact number. We're trying to see how close we can get to the exact number. That's why there's a margin of error of plus or minus 3 or plus or minus 4. So those are sources of uncertainty that cannot be made to go away. Anytime you're trying to gauge public opinion and you're trying to estimate it based on a sample, there's always some uncertainty in your estimate. There's always a possibility that you're wrong. But there are other sources of uncertainty in public opinion polls that I call potential sources of uncertainty. And the reason I call them potential sources of uncertainty is that we know it's a problem. We know that there's a potential problem here. And we can fix it ahead of time if we think things out carefully. And there are two particular kinds that I want to go ahead and talk about now, although there are other ones as well. One particular kind are called question wording effects. Question wording effects. So let me read the definition and then I'll go ahead and explain it. Sometimes seemingly incidental differences in the way the questions are worded can profoundly affect how people respond. When I say seemingly incidental, I mean seemingly unimportant, things that don't seem like they should make that big of a difference. Sometimes you can ask people two questions and basically the questions are asking about the exact same thing, but people will go ahead and respond differently. So for example, there's been a big discussion about whether or not people should be allowed to take their own lives. If they're terminally ill, whether someone should be able to basically kill themselves. And there are some people who argue, yeah, you can. And some people who say, no, you shouldn't be able to. And there's a whole bunch of feelings about this debate. But that's basically the question is, should somebody, if they're terminally ill, they're really sick, they're in pain a lot, should they be able to take their own life? Should they be able to basically commit suicide with the help of a doctor? So the way it works is like a doctor would get them in a bed, hook up some drugs to them like in their arm or something, and then they set it up, and the doctor can't like sort of do it himself. They have to set it up and make sure that they can just pull some lever, something like it's in their arm, and they pull it and it lets the drugs in and then they die, kind of like putting them to sleep, okay? So that's the big debate. And so this polling group, the Pew Research Center, did a study and they wanted to find out how people felt about it. And so they asked people questions about this. And the first question, so they asked them two questions, and they're basically the same exact thing. They asked them about whether or not it would be cool to make it was okay to make it legal for doctors to go ahead, and in one case what they went ahead and they asked was whether it was legal for doctors, whether they thought it should be okay to make it legal for doctors to give terminally ill patients the means to end their lives. Then they were also asked whether or not a little bit later, whether they thought it was okay to make it legal for doctors to assist terminally ill patients in committing suicide. Now, committing suicide and ending your life are exactly the same thing. It's hard for me to imagine, or maybe it's hard for us to understand, except that, that somebody would say, yeah, I'm in favor of making it legal for doctors to be able to help terminally ill patients to end their lives, but not to commit suicide. It's the same thing, right? It's the exact same thing. And yet, in that study, 51% favored the idea of making it legal for doctors to give terminally ill patients to assist them in taking their own lives, but only 44% favored making it legal for doctors to assist terminally ill patients in going ahead and committing suicide. They're basically the same thing. They're exactly the same thing. But people respond very differently because of the words that you use. And so we never know exactly if a question has something in it that's causing people to respond differently. There was another survey that was done that asked people whether they thought we should be spending more, less, or about the same amount on. And some people were asked whether we should be spending more or less or the same amount on rehabilitation, drug rehabilitation. And then the other group was asked whether we should be spending more or less the same amount on helping people with their addiction to drugs, right? Those are asking the same things. And yet people actually were much more likely to support the idea that we should be spending more on helping people who are addicted to drugs than they were on drug rehabilitation. Why? Just the words meant something different. So the problem is that the way you ask a question can sometimes affect how people answer. Now, again, I'm not talking about questions like, sometimes people will do polls. They're called push polls. They're not real polls. They'll say, knowing that Barack Obama is a socialist Kenyan who wasn't really born in the United States, do you approve or disapprove of the job he's doing? Right? That's not what I'm talking about. Those words are really wrong. Knowing that Republicans hate black people, do you support Mitt Romney or not? It's like those aren't polls. Those are people they're not trying to gauge your opinion, estimate your opinion, they're trying to shape your opinion. So I'm not talking about obvious big changes in the words that people use. I'm talking about incidental differences, things that don't seem like they should make that big of a deal. Question wording effects. The way the question is worded can profoundly affect how people respond. Now, what's the solution to question wording effects? What we do is instead of just asking one question about a topic, we'll ask a bunch of different questions about a topic. So if we want to know what people think about letting people take their own lives, we'll ask them the two different questions that were asked, in this poll, whether the doctors should be able to help them commit suicide, whether doctors should be able to help them end their lives. We may ask them a question about whether or not it should only be terminally ill patients, whether people who are just really sick but aren't expected to die soon. A series of questions. And what you do is you ask a whole bunch of questions and then try and look at all the questions to get an idea of what people really think. So instead of just asking one or two questions, you ask multiple questions and try and get a better idea. Because as we talked about before, people have multiple and conflicting ideas about the same thing. We have positives and negatives in our head, and sometimes the best thing to do is to ask a whole bunch of questions and then try and get a gauge of what people's real opinion is about a topic. The other potential source of uncertainty is something called question order effects. This is when the order of questions can profoundly affect how people respond to a question. And in question order effects, let me give you an example of a sort of classic question order effect that we see all the time. And again, what I mean is the order in which questions are asked can profoundly affect responses. A lot of times in public opinion polls, we ask questions that we call political knowledge questions. You can see the list on there and you can try and answer them for yourself and see whether you score a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4. But what we do is we try and find out how politically knowledgeable people are who are answering our polls, because sometimes we expect knowledgeable people to respond one way and less knowledgeable people to respond another way. Another thing that we're often interested in public opinion polls is how much attention do people pay to the news? How much are they watching the news? Are they paying attention a lot? Are they paying attention a little? Because that gives us an idea of whether or not their attitudes are being influenced by friends, by the media, what's going on. Well, it turns out that when you ask these political knowledge questions and how much attention they pay attention, pay attention to the news, depending on the order that you ask those questions, it really dramatically affects the way people respond. So, for example, suppose you go ahead and you just ask people, and just think about this yourself. If you call up people, they say, "Yeah, I'll do a survey. That's no problem," and you start asking them questions about how much they pay attention to the news, what do you think people are going to do? Are they going to tell the truth and say, yeah, this is how much news I watch? Are they going to make it sound like they watch more news than they really do? Or are they going to make it sound like they watch less news than they really do? Well, as it turns out, people will overstate how much news they watch. And why? Because they don't want to seem like slackers, right? You know, hi, yeah, I'll do a public opinion poll. How often do you watch the news? The news? I hate watching the news, right? How often do you read the paper? I don't read the paper. How often do you listen to the radio news? Don't do that either, right? People don't want to sound stupid. People don't want to sound like they're bad citizens. So people, if you ask these the attention to the news questions first, and then you ask these political knowledge questions afterwards, people will overstate how much news they watch. But if you ask the political knowledge questions first, if the first thing you do is you ask a bunch of questions about, you know, what are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution called, which party has a majority in the House of Representatives, these kind of questions, and then you ask them how much news they watch, people actually understate how much they watch. They say they watch less than they actually watch. And why? Because most people get those questions wrong. Most people don't know very much about politics. So nobody wants to go ahead and say, you know, they ask you, do you know this? You go, no. What about this? Don't know. What about this? Haven't got a clue. How much, you know, what about this? Don't know. Right? And then they say, oh, and how much news do you watch? Nobody's going to say like, oh, I watch the news all the time. I'm just stupid, right? I mean, that's exactly what happens. People don't want to miss all those questions and then say, hey, I watch the news all the time. So what they do is they say, I never watch the news. Yeah, I'm really busy, working 2 jobs, the whole thing, wife, the kids, all that stuff. People will understate how much news they watch. If you ask the attention to the news questions first, they say they watch more than they do. If you ask the political knowledge questions first, they will say they watch less than they do. The order that the questions are asked can affect how people respond. Now, what do? One of the ways that we get around that is we just randomly ask these questions. Some people get the political knowledge questions first. Some people get the attention to the news questions first, and we sort of flip it around randomly. Different people get different orders, and we kind of hope that if we take everybody's answers and kind of average it, we'll get the truth. So what we do is the solution to the problem is to ask the same questions in random order, though. Sometimes the political knowledge questions are first, sometimes the attention to the news questions are first, and you just flip it back and forth and hope that when you take the average of everybody, it's somewhere close to the truth. These are potential sources of uncertainty because we know that this is happening. We can do something about it. Okay, so we have sources of uncertainty that can't be made to go away. Confidence intervals, our margins of errors, that's in every public opinion poll. The question wording effects, the question order effects. We can try and make sure that we ask questions, multiple questions, or we can go ahead and put the questions in random order and hope that the average gets us closer to the truth. Okay? Public opinion polls.